Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the isolated hills of Valle Azul, surrounded by fields of golden wheat and cornfields, the Silva farm stood as a landmark of prosperity and tradition. The family had cultivated the land for generations, passing the secrets of cultivation and harvesting from father to son. However, peace and tranquility were threatened by an evil that lurked in the shadows. In recent years, the community has been plagued by a series of brutal murders during the harvest. The killer, known only as the Grim Reaper, struck without warning, leaving mutilated bodies and cryptic clues. The local police were perplexed, and fear hung over the city like a thick fog. John Silva, the family patriarch, decided to protect his loved ones and uncover the mystery behind the attacks. I arrived at my parents' farm on a late October afternoon, when the sky was tinged with shades of orange and purple. The gentle wind carried the familiar scent of earth and foliage. My name is Lucas Silva, and after years in the big city, I returned to help my family during the harvest. The atmosphere was heavy, and whispers about the Grim Reaper were constant. My father, John, seemed more tired and worried than ever, and my mother, Maria, avoided going out after dark. As I walked through the courtyard, looking at the fields ready for harvest, my mind was full of questions. How did the Grim Reaper manage to get away with it every year? Why did he choose harvest time to attack? I decided I wouldn't rest until I found the answers. That night, I sat with my parents in the softly lit kitchen. The heat from the wood stove contrasted with the growing cold outside. The conversation was tense, and I could feel the unspoken fear in my parents' words. "We need to stay alert, Lucas. The Grim Reaper always attacks when we least expect it," said my father, with his eyes fixed on the window. "I know, Dad, and that's why I'm here. Let's find out who's behind this," I replied, trying to convey confidence. I decided to stand guard that night. The silence on the farm was unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of crickets and the wind that shook the trees. The full moon illuminated the fields, casting elongated, sinister shadows. Armed with a flashlight and a rifle, I began my vigil. Hours passed without incident. The monotony of the night almost made me let my guard down, but a strange noise caught my attention. It was a metallic sound, as if something was being dragged. My heart skipped a beat, and I followed the sound to the barn. I opened the door slowly, the wood creaking loudly in the silence of the night. Inside, the darkness was almost total, except for the beam of light from my flashlight. As I investigated the barn, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the flashlight light illuminated a figure in the corner. A scare ran through my body, but as I got closer, I realized it was just a scarecrow. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I returned to the house, trying to shake off the fear. The next morning, I told my father about what happened in the barn. He frowned, worried. "We need to be more attentive. The Grim Reaper is playing with our minds," he said. The following days were tense. As the harvest progressed, the fear of a new attack grew. We decided to organize night patrols between family members and some close neighbors. The tension was palpable, and everyone knew that the Reaper could strike at any moment. During one of these rounds, while walking through the field, I heard that metallic sound again. This time it seemed closer. I followed the sound cautiously, my rifle ready. The sound took me to the grain silo. I opened the door slowly, the darkness inside swallowing me. The flashlight shook in my hands, and each step echoed in the oppressive silence. Inside the silo, the smell of grain and dust was strong. The metallic sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my heavy breathing. The tension increased with every second. Suddenly, the silo door closed with a bang. and I found myself trapped in total darkness. Panic started to take over me, but I tried to stay calm. I heard footsteps around me, shadows moving in the darkness. My heart beat frantically as I felt my way back to the door. When I finally found it, I realized it was locked out. I knocked on the door, screaming for help, but the sound seemed to be lost in the vastness of the night. Suddenly, a faint light appeared on the other side of the silo. My eyes adjusted to the light, revealing a hooded figure holding a knife. It was the Grim Reaper. His presence was terrifying, and I could feel the evil emanating from him. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The Reaper didn't respond. Instead, he began to approach slowly, the knife's blade glinting in the flashlight light. My survival instinct kicked in. I picked up a piece of wood from the ground and prepared to defend myself. The figure advanced quickly, and a desperate struggle began. The Reaper was agile and strong, but I was determined to survive. I managed to disarm him and push him away, but he quickly got up, ready to attack again. Suddenly, I heard voices outside. My father and some neighbors had heard my screams and came to my rescue. The silo door was opened, and the light from the lanterns illuminated the interior. The Reaper, finding himself at a disadvantage, fled into the darkness of the fields. "Are you okay, Lucas?" asked my father, helping me up. "Yes, but he's still out there. We need to catch it before it attacks again," I replied, breathing hard. We organized a search of the fields, but the Reaper seemed to have disappeared. The feeling of victory was replaced by frustration. We knew he was still at large and that the threat was not over. The days passed in a state of constant vigilance. We decided to reinforce the farm's security and continue night patrols. However, the Reaper did not attack again. He seemed to be waiting for the right moment to return. During one particularly quiet night, I heard a familiar sound coming from the barn. I grabbed my rifle and ran there, my father at my side. Inside the barn, we find an old diary hidden among the floorboards. The pages were filled with notes about the harvest and our family history. Between the pages, we found letters and documents that revealed dark secrets. We discovered that the Grim Reaper was a former farm employee, fired by my grandfather after being accused of theft and violence. Since then, he sought revenge against the Silva family. The letters showed a troubled mind, obsessed with punishing those he believed had ruined his life. With this new information, we took the evidence to the police. The search for the Grim Reaper intensified, and the Valle Azul community came together to help. The Silva farm became a symbol of resistance against terror. However, we knew that the fight was not over yet. The Reaper was somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again, and we were ready to face it, protecting our family and our land from any threat. As the full moon illuminated the golden fields, the feeling of danger persisted. The harvest continued, but the fear of the Reaper never completely disappeared. And so, the battle between light and dark continued, with the Silva family determined to win no matter how dire the threat lurking in the shadows. The discovery of the diary and letters sent my mind into overdrive. The revelation that the Grim Reaper was a former farm employee, seeking revenge for his dismissal and the injustices he believed he had suffered, added a layer of terror to the situation. The hatred and obsession in his words were palpable, making it clear that he would stop at nothing to get his revenge completely. That night, as the full moon illuminated the golden fields, a feeling of constant vigilance came over us all. Every shadow seemed to hide imminent danger, and every noise made our hearts skip a beat. We felt like the Grim Reaper was always nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike again. We were all gathered in the living room of the main house, trying to come up with a strategy to protect the farm. My father, John, was sitting in the rocking chair, his face serious and worried. "We need to keep our guard up. We can't allow ourselves to relax for even a minute," he said, his voice firm but filled with tension. "Lucas, you must continue with the night patrols. We will reinforce security in barns and silos." I nodded, determined to protect my family and end this threat once and for all. My mother, Maria, brought a tray of coffee and cakes, trying to keep morale high, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The hours passed slowly, each of us taking on our responsibilities with renewed vigilance. As night fell, I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, ready to begin my patrol. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was almost deafening. The farm seemed like a maze of shadows and invisible threats. I walked to the barn, where I would begin my inspection. The door creaked open, and the familiar smell of hay and aged wood enveloped me. The light from the flashlight revealed the empty and peaceful interior, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I began to walk around the space, listening for any suspicious sound or movement. Suddenly, I heard a crack behind me. I turned quickly, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the shadows. There was nothing visible, but the feeling of imminent danger intensified. I continued my rounds, checking every nook and cranny of the barn. As I walked, I heard a soft, almost indistinguishable whisper, "Lucas, Lucas." The voice seemed to come from everywhere, and a chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore the growing fear and continued forward. I left the barn and headed towards the silo. The cold wind was blowing, and the trees around the farm swayed gently, as if they were whispering ancient secrets. The silo loomed large in front of me, and the door creaked as I opened it. Inside the silo, the smell of grain was strong, mixed with the odor of mold and decay. The darkness was total, except for the beam of light from my flashlight. I began to explore, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I turned, and the beam of light revealed the hooded figure of the Grim Reaper, the knife glinting in the flashlight light. He advanced quickly, and I barely had time to react. I raised the rifle, but he knocked me down with a strong blow. I fell to the ground, the flashlight rolling away. Darkness enveloped me, and I could hear the Reaper's heavy breathing approaching. I tried to get up, but he pinned me down, the blade of the knife pressing against my throat. "Your family stole everything from me," he whispered, his voice thick with hate. "And now, you will pay for this." I fought against him with all my strength, trying to push the knife away. We managed to roll him to the ground, and I managed to disarm him. I took the knife and pointed it at him, breathing heavily and my heart beating frantically. "The game is over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The Reaper laughed, a cold, insane laugh. "Do you think you can stop me? Revenge never ends, Lucas." Before I could respond, I heard voices outside. My father and neighbors were coming to my rescue. The silo door opened, and flashlight light illuminated the interior. The Reaper, seeing himself at a disadvantage, tried to flee, but the men quickly surrounded him. We managed to capture and tie him up. The police were called, and he was taken into custody. The feeling of relief was palpable, but the tension didn't completely disappear. We knew that even though the Grim Reaper was trapped, the trauma he caused would remain. Over the next few days, the farm began to return to normal. The harvest continued, and the feeling of security gradually returned. However, the memories of the attacks were still fresh in our minds. One night, as I was going through my old diary again, I noticed something that I had overlooked. A mention of an accomplice, someone who helped the Grim Reaper from the shadows. Terror enveloped me again, and I knew our fight was not yet over. As the full moon shone in the night sky, the sense of danger persisted. The battle between light and darkness was not over yet, and we were determined to protect our family and our farm from any threat that came our way, no matter how dire or dark. And so, the true nature of the struggle was revealed. The Reaper may be trapped, but his seeds of fear and revenge still germinate. The war for the security of Valle Azul continued, and we were ready to face any challenge that the future brought. The revelation of an accomplice in the old notes brought back a terrifying chill. The Reaper may be trapped, but his shadow still looms over us. We were not alone in the fight for our survival. The farm continued to operate, but the feeling of being watched persisted, casting a shadow of doubt over everything we did. That night, a storm was approaching. Lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder boomed like war drums. The energy on the farm seemed to intensify, charged with an electric tension. Everyone was nervous, with their eyes always scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. After dinner, As the storm raged outside, I decided to review once again the diary and letters we had found. My mind was restless, seeking to understand the connection between the Reaper and his accomplice. The vague mention and fragmentary notes suggested that the accomplice was still at large, perhaps even living among us. My mother and father retired early, exhausted from recent events. I, however, could not rest. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to make a quick round of the farm, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The wind howled through the trees, and raindrops pelted my face. I began my rounds at the barn, the place where the first series of frightening events had begun. The old wood creaked beneath my feet, and the flashlight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Suddenly, I heard a distinct sound, a soft scratching, like nails against wood. My heart raced and the light from the flashlight flickered. I followed the sound, trying to remain calm. At the back of the barn, near the old wooden door, I saw a hooded figure. My blood ran cold as I recognized the hood of the accomplice. "Who's there?" My voice was firm, but I felt fear rising within me. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face I had not expected. It was Miguel, one of the oldest workers on the farm. His eyes were wide and filled with madness. "Lucas, you should never have gotten mixed up in this," he whispered, his voice thick with despair and rage. "The Reaper and I, we were a team. He wanted revenge, and I wanted justice." Before I could react, Miguel lunged with a knife, his movement swift and precise. I managed to dodge, but the blade sliced lightly across my arm. The sharp pain brought me back to the moment, and I fought with all my might. The storm raged outside, the sound of thunder and lightning echoing through the barn. Our fight was frantic, the lightning intermittently illuminating the room. I managed to disarm Miguel, and the knife clattered to the floor. "You don't understand," he screamed, his eyes filled with madness. "We were more than just avengers. We were the forgotten justice of this place." Miguel tried to attack me again, but I managed to restrain him and shoved him against the wall. He struggled, but I held him still. "Miguel, it's over. You and the Reaper have no power here anymore." He laughed, a cold, insane laugh. "Do you think that ends me? There are others like us, Lucas, and they will come." Before I could say more, I heard footsteps behind me. My father and the other farmhands had arrived, alerted by the sound of the fighting. We tied Miguel up and took him to the main house, where he would wait for the police to arrive. As the storm subsided, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with the knowledge that our fight was far from over. Miguel had been captured, but his words echoed in my mind. There were others. The threat still loomed over us. Over the next few nights, we continued our patrols and reinforced the farm's security. The sense of unity between us grew, but the shadow of the future threat never completely disappeared. The battle for our safety continued, but we were stronger and more determined to protect our family and our home. And so, under the pale light of the full moon, with the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind, we knew that although we had won this battle, the war against fear and revenge was far from over. The Valle Azul Ranch remained, a symbol of resistance and courage, but also a constant battleground against the forces that sought to destroy it. On the Montero family farm in the interior of a remote and isolated region, he kept secrets as old as his lands. The barn, an imposing and decrepit building, had always been a source of curiosity and fear among local residents. They said that there, in the past, terrible things had happened involving the former owner family. Stories of disappearances, rituals, and a violin that played alone during the night were told around campfires, fueling the popular imagination. My name is Rafael Montero, and I inherited this farm from my grandparents. I grew up hearing the dark stories, but never paid much attention. However, upon moving there after my parents' death, I began to realize that perhaps there was more truth to the legends than I cared to admit. The decision to explore the barn came in a moment of desperation and curiosity. I needed to know what was real behind the rumors. I arrived at the barn at dusk, the dim light of the sun setting over the horizon and casting long, unsettling shadows across the land. The structure, made of dark, aged wood, stood like a silent and sinister guardian. The wind was cold, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and dry leaves. My heart was beating fast, but my determination was stronger than my fear. I entered the barn, pushing open the door, which creaked loudly, as if protesting my presence. The air inside was cold and heavy, filled with damp and decay. My flashlight illuminated the old farm tools hanging on the walls and the hay spread across the floor. The atmosphere was almost palpably oppressive, as if the walls themselves were whispering long-buried secrets. I began to explore, looking for anything that could confirm the stories I had heard since I was a child. My every step echoed through the empty barn, creating a feeling of overwhelming loneliness. In a corner, I found an old trunk covered in dust and cobwebs. When I opened it, I came across objects that seemed to belong to a distant past. Old clothes, broken toys, and at the bottom, a dusty violin. I picked up the violin carefully, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. It was a beautiful instrument despite its state of neglect. Suddenly, a soft, melancholy sound filled the air, as if someone was playing the violin. I looked around, but there was no one. The melody seemed to come from within my own mind, filling me with a sense of deep sadness and despair. "Who's there?" My voice sounded faint in the darkness, echoing through the empty barn. There was no response, only the melody continued, now louder and more distressing. My heart raced and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I decided to leave the barn, but as I turned around, I saw a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. It was an indistinct figure, a presence that seemed more like an impression in the darkness. "Help us." A faint, barely audible whisper echoed through the barn. My mind was in turmoil, and the feeling of terror was increasing. I kept walking, trying to tune out the melody and the whispers. The barn seemed like a maze of shadows and inexplicable noises. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper into a nightmare. I reached the back of the barn, where a staircase led to the basement. The cellar door was ajar, and a faint, flickering light was escaping through the cracks. My instinct told me not to go down, but something stronger was pushing me forward. I walked down the stairs carefully, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was a place of absolute oppression. The stone walls were covered in strange and disturbing symbols. In the center of the basement, there was a wooden table with melted candles and remains of objects that seemed to be used in rituals. The air was heavy, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around, and there was the spectral figure of a woman. She had an expression of sadness and despair, and her eyes were fixed on me. "You need to end this," she whispered, her voice echoing through the basement. "My spirit is trapped here because of the rituals. Find my father's diary and destroy it. Only then will I be able to rest." My mind was in chaos, but I knew I needed to follow his instructions. I returned to the upper floor of the barn. Looking for any clues about the aforementioned diary, I found an old bookcase covered in dust. Among the dusty books was a worn leather diary. The pages were filled with notes about dark rituals and disturbing experiments. With the diary in hand, I went down to the basement again. The spectral figure was still there, waiting. I placed the diary on the table and used one of the candles to burn it. The pages began to disintegrate, and the figure let out a high-pitched scream before disappearing. The shadows on the walls dissipated, and the violin melody stopped. The feeling of oppression lessened, and the air became lighter. He knew he had freed at least one spirit, but the barn still held many secrets and horrors. I grabbed my gear and left the barn, determined never to return. As I walked back to the house, the full moon lit my path, casting strange, unsettling shadows along the road. Although I had managed to free at least one spirit trapped in the barn, I knew that many other souls were still at the mercy of the dark forces there. The battle was far from over, and the relief I felt was quickly replaced by new determination. I got home and immediately locked all the doors and windows. The silence of the night felt heavier than ever, as if the air itself was waiting for something. I decided to review the diary entries again, trying to find any clues that could help me better understand the curse that haunted the barn. I spent hours reading the remaining pages of the diary, discovering disturbing details about the rituals performed in the barn. The notes described how the former owner tried to cure people by subjecting them to sensory deprivation treatments, deep hypnosis, and even spiritual reconnection rituals. Many of these experiments resulted in horrific deaths or the unexplained disappearance of patients. As I read, something caught my attention, a mention of a secret room in the basement of the barn where the darkest rituals were performed. I decided I needed to go back there and find out what was in the secret room. But this time I wouldn't go alone. I invited my friend Marcos, who has always been skeptical about the supernatural, to accompany me. I told him everything I had discovered, and although he was reluctant, he agreed to help me. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and some tools, we returned to the barn the next night. Upon arrival, the feeling of oppression and fear immediately returned. We entered the barn, and the cold, thick air enveloped us. We followed the empty corridors, now even more frightening with the presence of Marcos, whose cynical comments failed to dispel the growing tension. We went underground, where the darkness seemed even more intense. We looked for the entrance to the secret room and finally found it hidden behind a false wall. Upon opening the door, a musty, decaying smell hit us, and we entered cautiously. The secret room was even more disturbing than I imagined. The walls were covered in strange ancient symbols, and in the center of the room was a large stone circle marked with dried blood. Surgical instruments and other macabre objects were scattered everywhere, and the air was filled with a sense of pure evil. Marcos, trying to maintain his composure, began filming the room with his camera, while I examined the symbols on the walls. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and we heard whispers around us. The lights of the lanterns began to flicker, and a dense shadow began to form in the center of the pedestrian circle. The shadow took shape, revealing the spectral figure of a man, the former owner of the barn. His gaze was fixed on me, and his eyes shone with a mixture of pain and anger. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. "The curse is stronger than you imagine. You can't stop me." Before we could react, the figure began to move towards us, and the feeling of oppression increased. The shadows on the walls moved, and the whispers became harrowing screams. Marcos, in panic, tried to run out, but the room door closed with a bang, locking us inside. "Raphael, what's happening?" Marcos shouted, his voice full of fear. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I replied, trying to remain calm. "We need to find a way to free these souls." I remembered diary entries about a spiritual reconnection ritual. We needed to complete the ritual to break the curse. I frantically searched for the diary and found the instructions for the ritual. Marcos and I began following the steps, drawing symbols on the floor and reciting the ancient words. As the ritual progressed, the spectral figure writhed and screamed, and the shadows around us became more aggressive. Finally, with the last word of the ritual, an intense light filled the room, and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing. Silence returned, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. The door to the living room opened by itself, and Marcos and I quickly stepped out, breathing heavily. We returned to the surface, relieved to be out of that hell. As we walked back to the house, I looked at the barn one last time. I knew there were still many secrets and horrors hidden there, but at least part of the curse had been broken. The night was darker than ever, and the feeling that something terrible was yet to come never completely left me. The farm seemed quieter, but I knew that true peace was still just out of reach. When we got home, we locked all the doors and windows again, trying to create a barrier between us and the horrors we had faced. We sat in the living room, silent, still trying to process everything that had happened. Suddenly, the light began to flicker. I exchanged an apprehensive look with Marcos, and my heart raced. The terror of the barn seemed to be following us. A low, scratching sound, like nails scraping on wood, came from the front door. I slowly stood up and walked to the door, my whole body shaking with fear. "Raphael, don't open it," Marcos whispered, his voice shaking. Ignoring the warning, I looked through the peephole. Outside in the darkness, I saw nothing. I took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, trying to get a better look. The scratching suddenly stopped, and an oppressive silence filled the house. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice sounding weak and nervous. Without an answer, I closed the door and turned to Marcos. Before I could say anything, all the lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and I began to hear indistinct whispers around me. "We need to get out of here," Marcos said, his voice full of panic. I grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, illuminating the room. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of the light, dancing and distorting in eerie ways. Suddenly, a chill filled the air and a figure appeared in the center of the room. It was the same spectral figure as the barn's previous owner, but now it seemed stronger and more defined. "Do you think you can get rid of me so easily?" the figure whispered, its voice echoing unnaturally. "The curse never ends. You are bound by it now." Marcos and I backed away, trying to get away from the figure, but it stepped forward, extending a translucent hand toward us. The temperature of the room dropped even further, and my body began to shake uncontrollably. The shadows around the figure contorted, forming horrified faces and mouths open in silent screams. "We have to do something," I muttered, my mind racing for a solution. Marcos picked up one of the remaining pages of the journal and began to recite a passage that sounded like a banishing incantation. The spectral figure let out a piercing scream, and the shadows began to thrash even more. But instead of disappearing, the figure seemed to grow stronger under the spell. "No, it's making him stronger," I cried. Desperately, we searched for another solution. I grabbed a candle and lit it, hoping the light would drive away the darkness. The candle flame flickered violently but remained lit. The spectral figure paused for a moment, and the shadows retreated slightly. "Keep the light," Marcos said, his voice strained. I walked towards the figure with the candle, trying to push it back. The candle light seemed to create a temporary barrier, but it was not enough to completely dispel the evil presence. The figure writhed and let out an agonized scream before disappearing completely, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. But we knew we weren't done. The feeling of oppression and dread lingered, as if the curse was still present. The house was completely silent, except for the sound of our labored breathing. We decided that the only way to end this was to destroy all remaining connections to the barn. We burned the remaining pages of the diary and any other objects that might be linked to the curse. The flames quickly consumed everything, and for a brief moment I felt a sense of relief. But at the same time, I realized that something was still wrong. As the last flame died down, I heard a distant, growing sound of music. It was the melody of the violin, the same one we had heard in the barn. The music seemed to come from inside my mind, growing louder and more piercing. The shadows on the walls began to move again, and the feeling of intense cold returned. I looked at Marcos, and his face was pale with fear. "This can't be happening," he murmured. The spectral figure reappeared in the center of the room, now stronger and more defined than ever. "You can never get rid of me," she said, her voice full of hatred and despair. "I am the curse, and you are destined to suffer for all eternity." The shadows around us closed in, and the feeling of oppression became unbearable. The violin music reached a deafening crescendo, and everything around us began to spin. The ground beneath our feet seemed to dissolve, and reality disintegrated into total darkness. At that moment, I knew that we were forever trapped in the curse of the barn, destined to wander in darkness forever, with no hope of salvation. The fight against the forces of darkness never ends, and we have been defeated, trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair. No one ever knew what really happened to us. The farm remained, a silent monument to terror and evil. The region avoided talking about the barn, and over time it was forgotten. becoming just another dark legend in local history. But at night, those who dared approach swore they heard whispers and a distant violin melody, eternal reminders of a curse that can never be broken. In the heart of a rural region forgotten by time, stood Greenfield Farm, a place with a history marked by prosperity and tragedy. The lonely grain silo, now covered in rust and vegetation, was a grim reminder of past events. During the Great Depression, the farm was the scene of strange disappearances, and local people avoided the place as if it were cursed. Stories about human experiments and macabre rituals were whispered by the elders, but never confirmed. It was there, among the echoes of the past, that I, Lucas, together with my friends, would decide to explore the silo in search of adventure. However, our search for excitement would quickly turn into an unimaginable nightmare. When I arrived at Greenfield Farm, dusk was falling, casting long, menacing shadows over the towering silo. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and vegetation. My flashlight was the only source of light as I pushed open the rusty iron gate, which creaked loudly as if protesting my presence. My heart was beating fast, but my determination to uncover the secrets that haunted the farm was stronger than my fear. I entered the farm, and the air immediately grew colder. The sound of the wind seemed amplified by the empty space, creating an ominous melody that echoed around me. My name is Lucas, and since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by mystery and horror stories. My grandfather used to tell me about his adventures in places forgotten by time, and it was he who inspired me to follow the path of curiosity and exploration. Greenfield Farm was one of those places that always intrigued me. Rumors of macabre experiments and mysterious disappearances drew me in, and I was determined to discover the truth. As I walked around the grounds, the lantern illuminated scenes from a time gone by. Rusty agricultural machinery, remains of barbed wire fences, and old silos covered in vines. I began exploring, taking photos and capturing the unsettling silence that seemed to swallow everything around me. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of crows and the rustling of leaves. I passed an old barn, its doors hanging on rusty hinges. The air was filled with a feeling of abandonment, but also with an invisible presence that seemed to be watching my every move. I continued walking until I reached the silo, where a rusty iron staircase spiraled to the top. I hesitated for a moment before beginning to climb, each step echoing through the empty structure. When I reached the top, the view was both magnificent and frightening. The setting sun cast an orange glow over the fields, but the shadows lengthened eerily. I looked down and saw my friends, Anna, Pedro, and Clara, who had decided to wait on the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine and decided to go down again to explore the inside of the silo. The entrance to the silo was a heavy wooden door, which opened with a loud creak. The air inside was thick and damp, and a musty smell permeated the room. I shined my flashlight inside, revealing concrete walls covered in moss and vegetation. I began to descend an iron staircase that led to the bottom of the silo, each step echoing like a drum. When I reached the bottom, the darkness was total. The flashlight only illuminated a small area around me, and the silence was oppressive. I began to explore, shining the flashlight over the walls and floor. I saw what looked like a metal door in the far corner of the silo. Approaching cautiously, I noticed that the door was partially open. I approached the door, feeling a chill run down my spine. I opened the door with a quick movement, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched into darkness. The sound I heard earlier now seemed to be everywhere, an indistinct whisper that made the skin crawl. I decided to continue my exploration, determined to discover more. I passed through more hallways and rooms, each one scarier than the last. In one of the rooms, I found an old laboratory. The table was covered in glass vials and rusty scientific equipment. The walls were covered in graffiti and signs of vandalism, but it was still possible to see traces of the old laboratory. In one corner, an iron stretcher lay covered in dust, with worn leather straps dangling from the sides. As I took photos, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and a feeling of oppression grew. Suddenly I heard a soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from all directions. I looked around, but there was no one. The whisper continued, now accompanied by a soft melody, as if someone were playing a violin. I remembered the stories my grandfather had told me about the farm. They said that the former owner, a man named Arthur Greenfield, was a doctor who used the farm to conduct human experiments during the Great Depression. He believed that he could find a cure for various diseases using unorthodox methods. This obsession led to the ruin of the farm and its abrupt closure. My curiosity about the violin grew, and I began to follow the melody, which seemed to guide me through the dark corridors of the silo. With each step I took, the melody became clearer, but also more sinister. I passed rooms filled with old medical equipment, some with dark stains that I preferred not to identify. The shadows on the walls moved strangely, as if they were following my movements. I reached a smaller room, where the melody of the violin was louder. In the center of the room was a wooden pedestal, and on it an old dusty violin. The sight of the violin made my heart race. The instrument emanated an ominous aura, and the feeling of oppression became almost unbearable. I approached the violin and, without thinking, reached out to play it. The moment my fingers touched the instrument, a wave of intense cold ran through my body. The melody stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, except for the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. My mind was in turmoil, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. I decided to leave the room and look for more clues about what was happening in the silo. As I walked through the hallways, I began to notice that some objects had changed places. Jars that had previously been in one position were now in another, and some tools seemed to have been moved. I arrived at an office that appeared to be the owner's. The room was filled with old papers, accounting books, and photos of the farm in its glory days. In one of the drawers, I found a journal that belonged to Arthur Greenfield. The pages were filled with notes about ancient experiments and rituals. One of the entries caught my eye. Today, I attempted the ritual again. Music is the key, but something is still missing. The souls of the experiments are trapped between this world and the next. I must find the perfect object to channel their essences. I cannot fail. My mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The experiments, the violin melody, the whispers. It was all connected. Arthur Greenfield had become involved in something much darker than anyone could have imagined. I decided to return to the violin room to investigate further. When I got there, I felt a chill in the air and the melody began again, this time louder and more intense. The shadows around the pedestal stirred, forming a spectral figure. It was a woman, her expression one of sadness and despair. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "Arthur tried to bring me back, but he failed. Now I am trapped and the silo is cursed." My heart was pounding, and the fear was almost paralyzing. "What can I do to help?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Destroy the violin," she replied. "It is the source of the curse. Only then will my soul be at rest." I picked up the violin, feeling the intense cold in my hands. I looked up at the spectral figure, who was watching me with sad eyes. I knew I had to do this, but the fear was overwhelming. With all my strength, I smashed the violin against the floor. The sound of cracking wood echoed through the room, and the spectral figure let out a sharp scream before disappearing. The mellow stopped, and the air in the room grew warm again. I felt a sense of relief, but also sadness. I knew I had freed the woman's soul, but the silo still held many secrets and dangers. I gathered my equipment and decided to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I left the silo, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the fields. The feeling of being watched hadn't completely faded, and I knew my journey was far from over. Greenfield Farm had only been the beginning. As I walked back to town, night was quickly falling, enveloped in a blanket of darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. The sense of relief I had felt after destroying the violin was quickly replaced by a new unease. The forest surrounding the farm was shrouded in thick fog, and every shadow seemed to hide a dark secret. My legs were tired, but I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a pop to my left. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything. Silence returned, but my heart was still beating fast. I quickened my pace, trying to leave the damned place behind. As I walked through the forest, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched increased, and I began to hear soft, almost inaudible whispers around me. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me like an invisible circle. I stopped again, trying to locate the source of the whispers, but the fog and darkness made it difficult to see. Finally, I saw the city lights in the distance. The relief I felt upon seeing them was indescribable. I quickened my pace, determined to leave that damned place behind. When I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time. The shadows seemed to move strangely, as if they were alive. I shook my head, trying to shake off the thoughts of terror, and continued walking until I reached the city. Upon entering the house, I locked the door and threw myself on the sofa, exhausted. My body hurt, and my mind was racing. I took out my diary and started writing down everything that had happened. The experience at Greenfield Farm had been terrifying, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to find out more about the curse and what had happened to Arthur Greenfield and his experiments. The following days were full of research and trying to understand the events in the silo. I discovered that Arthur Greenfield had been a man obsessed with getting his wife back, using increasingly dark methods. His search for the perfect essence led to a series of macabre experiments, and the farm was closed after a series of unexplained disappearances. While researching, I started to notice strange things happening around my house. Objects moved around on their own. I heard inexplicable noises at night, and the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, I woke up to the feeling of intense cold and realized that my room was full of dancing shadows. I got up and went to the living room. When I got there, I saw something that made me freeze in fear. In the center of the room, there was a violin, identical to the one I had destroyed in the silo. His empty eyes seemed to watch me, and a sinister smile was carved on his face. I picked up the violin with shaking hands and realized there was something written on its base. The words, "The curse never ends," were engraved there. My heart was beating fast, and the feeling of terror was overwhelming. I knew I needed to return to the farm to discover the truth behind the curse and possibly find a way to end it once and for all. I returned to the farm the next morning, determined to find answers. Upon entering, the feeling of oppression returned with full force. I began exploring again, this time looking for clues that could help me understand the curse. I found more notes from Arthur Greenfield, detailing his experiments and his search for the perfect essence. I discovered that there was a secret basement on the farm, where the darkest experiments were carried out. I found the entrance hidden behind a bookshelf in Arthur's office. The air in the basement was heavy and smelled of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols and scratch marks, and the floor was littered with unfinished violins and experiment materials. In the center of the basement, there was a large wooden table with an old book and a violin. The book was full of rituals and incantations, and the violin seemed to emanate a dark energy. I realized I needed to destroy both of them to end the curse once and for all. I picked up the book and the violin, feeling the weight of responsibility in my hands. As I prepared to destroy them, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the spectral figure of Arthur's wife with an expression of sadness and despair. "Please help me," she whispered. I'm stuck here because of my husband's obsession. You must end this." With renewed determination, I broke the violin and tore up the book, throwing the pieces on the floor. The spectral figure let out a piercing scream before disappearing, and a wave of energy coursed through the basement, dispelling the shadows and the feeling of oppression. I left the farm feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He knew he had freed Arthur's wife's soul, but the farm still held many secrets and dangers. My journey was far from over, and the fight against the forces of darkness would be endless. As I walked back to town, the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never quite left me. The dark forest held many secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, knowing that each discovery would bring new challenges and horrors to be discovered, faced. Upon returning home, locking the door, a brief relief enveloped me. However, the night was just beginning. A deafening silence filled the air, interrupted only by the sound of my own heart beating. The whispers I thought I'd left behind returned, intensifying as the darkness deepened. I felt a presence in my room, a shadow that moved on the periphery of my vision. I remembered the words of Arthur's wife's spirit. "Finish what you started." What was missing? I started going through my grandfather's notes again, looking for any clues, anything I might have missed. Lucas, who had decided to stay with me, tried to remain calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Suddenly, a violin sound began to play again, echoing throughout the house. I looked at Lucas, and together we followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the basement. We descended carefully, each step creaking beneath our feet. The air was colder and heavier, as if something was sucking the life out of the room. In the basement, we found a circle of lit candles, and in the center, a violin floated, played by a spectral figure. It was Arthur Greenfield. His look was one of pure fury and despair. "Do you think you can escape the curse?" he said, his voice echoing eerily. Lucas and I were paralyzed with fear. The violin melody seemed to penetrate our minds, paralyzing us with its anguished sound. He knew that the only way to end it was to destroy the source of the curse, Arthur himself. "We need to do something," Lucas muttered, his eyes fixed on the spectral figure. I remembered an ancient amulet, mentioned in my grandfather's notes, that had the power to seal restless souls away forever. I ran into the living room, frantically looking for the amulet. When I finally found it, I felt a wave of energy course through my body. I went back to the basement where Lucas was trying to distract Arthur. "Hold it to the melody," I said, holding the amulet firmly. Lucas began to recite the words of the protection ritual while I advanced with the amulet. Arthur let out an agonized scream, and the candles around us went out one by one. The amulet's light shone brightly, and Arthur's figure began to dissipate. "In the end, you will never escape," he whispered before disappearing completely. The silence that followed was absolute. The feeling of oppression dissipated, and the shadows withdrew, leaving the basement in ordinary darkness. We climbed slowly, feeling a strange peace, but knowing there was still something unsettling in the air. Back in the living room, Lucas and I sit exhausted. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I hope so," I replied, but deep down, I knew that the struggle between light and darkness is eternal. The following nights were peaceful, but the feeling of restlessness never completely left me. I felt that the curse of the Silo of Secrets still had claws on me, and so I continued my search, knowing that true terror never disappears. It only hides in the shadows, waiting to emerge again.